Hi, I'm Neelam Pathikonda.
And I'm Susanna Barkataki.
We're two best friends and professionals in yoga, wellness, and medicine talking about the most relevant wellness questions of our day.
Welcome to Radical Resilience, how to live well in a sick world. We're here to talk about a sometimes challenging but important topic that, if we are living, has impacted us or will impact us all, and that's grief.
As we record, over 500,000 people in the US have died of COVID-19. And research into human evolution shows that the human brain is not really inherently wired to make sense of these large numbers. Based on a National Geographic article, in 2020, the US saw more than a 15% increase in deaths, the highest rise since the 1918 flu pandemic.
To make sense of these numbers, let's talk about what is 500,000. There are 525, 600,000. Is that right? Let me just say that again. There are 525,600 minutes in a year. That's one COVID death a minute for almost a year.
It would take a wall almost 9 times the length of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. to list the name of every person in the U.S. who died of COVID.
This number is 25% greater than the U.S. military death toll in World War II. It's like losing all the inhabitants of Atlanta, Georgia, or all the U.S. Postal Service workers in 2018.
If each death were marked with a blink of an eye, it would take 14 hours of rapid blinking to count off all these victims.
And these numbers don't count all the deaths related to the virus, but weren't recorded as COVID-19 deaths, deaths before testing was widely available, or deaths from people who didn't go to the hospital earlier for fear of COVID. This is quite a staggering time that we are living in.
This is so important to talk about this issue of grief because oftentimes we just don't talk about it publicly. We feel like we need to hide. And when we're dealing with these kind of numbers, all of us are grieving. So when we think about this topic, we wanted to invite an expert in to speak about this issue. She's someone who has thought about this issue from many angles, both politically and personally. She's suffered through personal loss, and she's one of my besties. Malkia Devich-Cyril is an activist, writer, and public speaker on issues of digital rights, narrative power, Black liberation, and collective grief. Malkia is also the founding and former executive director of Media Justice, a national hub boldly advancing racial justice, rights, and dignity in a digital age. Malkia, thank you for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We wanted to start off this conversation by asking you about your experience with grief and in what ways grief has shaped you.
It's a big question, and I'm going to try and give a real answer, but a limited one. So, my mother was diagnosed with sickle cell anemia at birth. And, for those who don't know much about sickle cell anemia, it's a fatal genetic disease, or it was anyway. I know that there have been some innovations in recent years, particularly for children, but for adults born in the 40s or earlier, those innovations weren't available. And so my mother went into end stage sickle cell in 2002, and in 2005, she died while I slept beside her. But that unfortunately wasn't my first, intersection with loss. I have actually lost many people as a young person. My girlfriend was raped and thrown off the top of a building in the Bronx, and she was killed. I have had many cousins that have been killed. One who I was very, very close to, who was had her throat slit by her husband. I have experienced a lot of loss in my life. But I think the most profound loss of my life was the loss of my wife, which was very recent. Her name was Susanna Devich-Cyril, and she is the love of my life. We were married in 2015. And 1 year later, 2016, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And she fought bravely for 2 years and then died in 2018. The fact of her loss was a rearranging loss, which my mother's loss was also that, but it's different. You know, when you lose a parent, even if that loss is too soon, it's early, the parent is young, it's still somehow the order of things. From birth, you're moving away from your parent. From the moment you're born, you're separating from your parent. But with a spouse, this is the person you've chosen to come together with. You know, this is the person that you've decided to throw in with for what, if you're like me, for the rest of your life. So that was a different level of loss. And I'm still in the process of navigating that bereavement.
In June, there was a Washington Post poll that found that nearly 1 out of 3 Black Americans knew someone personally who died of COVID-19. And you know the death rate among Black individuals is up, it's like 10 times higher than white individuals. So we know that grief is not distributed equitably and never was. And like your story is so profound because there's so many ways that you've experienced loss at such a young age. And I know that you're not alone in that, but I do want to ask you about what grieving looks like for Black folks. Like, how is this a different question, a different rearranging, as you put it?
In the last year, 2020, we know that not only you mentioned this, 10 times that Black people are dying at 10 times the rate of white folks from COVID, but add that to the high rate of mortality for Black people on all diseases. The root cause of that is systemic racism in the healthcare system, or it's actually older, generationally passed down from slavery, the discrimination that we've experienced in terms of health, in terms of food, in terms of environment, in terms of housing, in terms of prisons, all of this limits our mortality. Over this past year, I mentioned that I lost my wife in 2018, but I've also lost 13 other people, only one of whom wasn't Black. I think that, or excuse me, I should say two of whom were not Black. And I think that it's relatively important that that is true, all right? I think it's a relatively significant number, a fact, that the vast majority of people that I've lost in this period of the last 5 years, that the majority of them are, one, Black women, okay? Because we also see a big narrative around the Black male death, but there's a big story here about the death of Black women, the death of Black trans women. There's all of these marginalized deaths. And so for Black folk across the board, loss is almost inherent in our experience. And I don't mean that, I want to clarify what I mean, because loss is inherent in all experience. Everybody dies. But because of the overwhelming rate of death, because mortality is younger for us, like we die younger, we die from more things, and when we die we are left with less, right? So our wealth isn't being passed either. All of these factors contribute to a kind of, doctors call it complicated grief, but it's more than complicated. It's colonial grief. It's grief that's born out of white supremacy. It's not simply the natural loss of a person. Grief in and of itself is a natural response to any loss. Bereavement, is really focused on loss due to death. They talk about complicated grief when they say grief that lasts longer than a year, which I think is ridiculous anyway. But then on top of that, we're talking generational grief. Not only the loss of individuals, in a natural order, but deeply unnatural traumatic loss, which scars generations of people, scars people on a collective level, as well as on an individual level. And Black people are not the only folks who experience this. Native Americans, migrants all over the world who've been pushed and pulled by war, by economic conditions, and forced to lose land, the landless. All of these are folks who have suffered incredible kinds of genocide, incredible losses that can't be quantified nor responded to in any of the traditional ways we think about responding to grief and loss.
Yes, so true. And it's so distinct, those experiences of grief. So, what would it look like for our culture to prioritize the space for us to grieve collectively in response to all of that ancestral grief, to systemic trauma, and also collectively, like in response to everything that's happening to us culturally, politically right now?
There's a few things to think about here. So, number one, mass grief and collective grief are not the same. So, mass grief is happening. The masses of people are grieving, both those who have directly lost someone to COVID, those who have borne witness to these losses. We all watched the bodies being stacked in the mobile freezers and the morgues and we all watched that on television. We've all watched, Black bodies being felled from police. We've become, and we have healthcare workers, journalists, all kinds of frontline workers who have become vulnerable witnesses to death, to tremendous death and tremendous suffering. Mass grief is happening already. But what is not happening is collective grief. Grief that where we are bound together by public offerings, by public art, by truth and reconciliation, where there is a visible process of truth and reconciliation. Because the fact is, when there's no reconciliation, when there's no reparation, then grief remains lodged in the body, whether the individual body or the collective body, the body politic. And so to metabolize those losses, we actually need action. Without action, that mass grief turns to apathy. It turns to alienation. It turns to amnesia. And what we cannot afford is amnesia. We really cannot afford that. I think public art, absolutely. I think a real huge transformation of our bereavement policies, the ability to, I think there's some reparation here too. I think that, the government, whether it was this administration or another, it doesn't matter. The state made decisions that directly led to the death of 500,000 people in this country alone. They made decisions, and those decisions resulted in death. Somebody needs to pay for that. Somebody needs to pay for that. And I believe that until somebody pays for that, we're not going to see true collective mourning. We're not going to see it. We might see some vigils. We might see some, we might see some things like that. We might come out. We're going to see the memorials, the public memorials, but we're not going to see a true metabolizing of loss.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm thinking, right now there may be folks listening to this who are in the midst of grieving. We right here might be. And so I'm wondering, what would you say, if you're sitting right there with or next to, what would you say to someone who's grieving right now?
Honestly, I would say nothing. I would sit beside them. I wouldn't advise them because my grief is not theirs. I don't know their grief. All I can do is ask questions and accompany them as they walk down on the journey. Grief is not an illness. It isn't a problem. It isn't something to be fixed. Many people want to fix it because they're uncomfortable with it. They want to make you happy. They want to make you feel better. They want to remind you that your loved one is still with you, even though you are sitting there without them. People tend to impose their religious and spiritual beliefs upon you, to tell you whatever it is, that they contacted your person, that they, all of the things without concern for what you believe, without a question for what you care about or what you need or what you want. And so you asked me, what would I say? I wouldn't say a damn thing. I would sit beside them. I've been very lucky and blessed to have friends that just say, come over. I mean, not now, obviously, in COVID, but prior to that, where I could just visit and just be myself, where I'm not forced to talk about things if I don't want to, but I'm invited to if I do want to. And I think that's what people who are grieving need, an invitation. An invitation. I'd also share that there are resources out here, grief groups. I go to one, I actually go to several. Unfortunately, for people like me, there aren't many that fit. Most of the grief groups that I've attended are mostly white. There are people of color, but not a whole lot. There are queer people, but not a whole lot. And so, we need grief groups that are focused on our grief. It's also difficult. It was difficult during the Trump administration to go to attend a grief group because there were people there who were supportive of Trump's policies and who didn't understand that part of what was complicating my grief was him. And that it wasn't invited or acceptable to speak politically in a space like that, even though my very existence and the reasons for my grief are political. There's a reason why so many of the people I lost are Black, and not just because I only know Black people, because I don't. I have a very multiracial life. But so I would offer those resources. I would accompany them, and I would encourage accompaniment. I would suggest a potential, maybe a grief counselor, or rather, I wouldn't even suggest that. I would provide them with the information, and then they could do what they wanted to do. What I would never do is advise a grieving person, ever. I would never tell them what is happening, what their dead loved one is saying or doing, or that their dead loved one would be proud of them if they did X. Because you know what? I don't know that person. People tell me all the time, oh, your wife would be so proud of you. How do you know? Have you met her? You know what I'm saying? Like, these are just assumptions made without any information. And so they ring hollow. That's the thing, they ring hollow. And anything that rings hollow, that doesn't ring authentic, will not help a grieving person. What grieving people need is authenticity, authentic relationship. And honestly, that's all a grieving person needs.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And your process, Malkia, of grieving and sharing your process, even though, you're really good friends with Neelam, and I know you through Neelam, you've shared so generously of your process on social media, and following you has helped me deepen in my own relationship to my own emotions. And I've seen some of what you've shared is your deep pain, but also some of your joy and some of the things that have come into your life, like your kittens, that have been, joyful and resilience practices, coping practices. I don't know if you name them that way or think of them that way, but I'm curious just to hear about that as well. Like what is showing up for you as resilience or coping or joy?
I remember when my mother was in the hospital one time, and she was, my mother was often in the hospital, and I would often have to drop everything and leave California and go to New York. And I was in my 20s, when all of this was happening. So it was very challenging. But I remember this one time I was there, me and my sister, we were playing some Sweet Honey in the Rock on the radio, and my mom was unconscious, that she had undergone a blood transfusion that they said was not going to take, that there was a big chance it might just kill her, because she had so many by that point. So we were we had tears, we were talking about, we had no money, we were broke, how we going to pay for a funeral? What we going to do? And my mom, who was not unconscious, lifted up her head and said, you could prostitute yourself. So we fell out. We fell out laughing. And I shared our story to say that grief is one face of love. Grief is not inherently sorrow. It's also joy. I was sitting earlier and I was listening to the Smiths, a thing I never do, but my wife loved the Smiths. And so I try to, I'm trying to dig into it. And the song came on and the lyrics just made me think of her. It just made me think of her. And the way I thought of her was just spinning and spinning and spinning, outside and singing the song, because we would always sing, me and her. We sang through her spinal taps. We sang when she came out of surgery, out of brain surgery to get those brain tumors removed. We sang when she had what appeared to be a stroke, but was really a hemorrhaging brain tumor in Maui on our anniversary. We sang all the time. We had healing ceremonies, drum ceremonies where people came and put their hands on her and sent her hope and wishes and love. We did moon ceremonies. We did set intentions. We were always celebrating, is my point, through the anticipatory grief. And I continue to celebrate because that's part of the grief, is the celebration. So, that's how I think of it. And you could say they're resilience practices, but I see them as grief practices, intentional acts of grief. Intentional acts of grief is not an emotion. Sorrow is an emotion. Grief is a state of being. It's a practice, I think. It's a way that I think I can live with grief by practicing it. Me being intentional around it rather than it taking me. You see what I'm saying? And so practicing joy as a form of grief, I think that's why I got them kittens. That's why I take my walks. I have fun. I might be crying, but I'm also having a good time. And that's how life is, if you look at it and if you experience it in truth. Instead of being in denial and running away, if you're truly rooted in your life, you are laughing and crying at the same time all the time.
It reminds me of a quote from V.S. Naipaul, who, it was writing on grief. He says, "We are never finished with grief. It is part of the fabric of living. It is always waiting to happen. Love makes memories in life precious. The grief that comes to us is proportionate to that love and is inescapable."
Yes, absolutely. I co-sign that 100%.
Thank you so much, Malkia. It's been an honor to have you on this podcast and to share your experiences so openly with the world. It's exactly what Susanna says. It keeps us grounded, but also it gives everyone permission to feel the grief, to feel the pain. I know that you would say that it's important to feel all of it, the joy, the pain, the grief, the sorrow, the laughter, because that's what living is, right? So I thank you for bringing your authentic self to us and to all of us online every day.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And keep doing it. I love that you're doing this work. It's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is there anything we can, or you would like to share with the listeners that could support you, or where folks can follow up with the work that you do?
People can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Culture Jedi. I'm also at Culture Jedi on Instagram. But to be honest, I don't accept follows from people I don't know on Instagram. So Twitter is the place to get me if we're strangers that want to become connected. I love to connect with new people on that platform. So follow me there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
That was a gift to hear Malkia's experience with grief. And I know we are all sitting with what she said and also sitting with our own grief, no matter how large or small, walking through the world, knowing all the people that have died, all the grievances that have happened, all the suffering that is happening, the destruction of the climate, the species that are going extinct. These are things that we need to sit with so that we can connect to this part of ourselves that makes us alive. So I'd like to move now into a meditation. If you can find a comfortable position, if you can, putting your feet on the floor or the ground or the earth, allowing yourself to feel held in whatever way that looks like for you. And taking a breath in and out, allowing the breath to fill you up, knowing that this nourishment is your birthright, but it is not one that's given to everyone. Allowing yourself to receive it with gratitude, with awe, knowing that life courses through you as it courses through every living thing on this planet, connecting us all. And also understanding that so many of us are in pain, are suffering, are grieving. I invite you to let your heart open just a little bit to this grief, to this pain, to this wild love, to the joy and laughter that it might bring, but also to the devastation. Perhaps silently calling out names of people you know, whose death still touches you. Perhaps the loss of nations, of people, of tribes, of species, of landscape. Call them out. Let them be heard. Let your heart sit with this feeling of loss. Breathing in through this heart space, knowing that you can hold this because you are not holding it alone. As you breathe in and out, you are breathing with every little living thing, big and little. We all want to survive. We all want to live. We all want to thrive. Connecting with that part as much as we connect with the loss. With the pain. With the sadness and the fear. We are expansive and big enough to hold all of these emotions without moving to fade or fix to make it feel better at all. We can just sit with what is right now. Breathing in, I acknowledge my grief. Breathing out, I know I can hold it together. allowing ourselves to feel the wholeness of our bodies and the wholeness of our beings. Perhaps calling to mind someone who gives us strength, someone we know who is holding us right now. Perhaps an ancestor, perhaps future generations, or simply the earth herself. Gently giving over this feeling of grief, this loss, our precious hearts, sharing it with this person, with these people, with the earth, knowing that we don't have to hold it alone. Burying it in the earth's core. Not as a way to remove, as a way to share, as a way of knowing and connecting ourselves with our source. Breathing in, I lay my grief down to the earth. Breathing out, I know the earth holds me. And at the sound of the bell, silently giving gratitude to ourselves for feeling all the depths of our emotions. Gratitude to the earth, our ancestors and future generations, those who helped to hold us, to guide us. And gratitude to this moment, to the grief that reminds us that love is a powerful emotion that courses through us and that reminds us that we are alive.
Thank you so much for that powerful meditation, Neelam. And my dear listeners, in some cases, grief doesn't get better, and you may not be able to accept the loss. Doctors call this complicated grief. So please talk to your doctor if you have any of the following: trouble keeping up your normal routine, like going to work and cleaning the house, feelings of depression, thoughts that life isn't worth living or harming yourself, any inability to stop blaming yourself, and if you feel you are numbing out with drugs, alcohol, food, or work. In our show notes, you can find some yoga practices for grief and also get a grounding meditation at our website, ignitebewell.com/radical resilience. And if you got something from this show, then please leave us a review and subscribe. Thank you for listening to Radical Resilience.